I think we'll just go ahead and get started now. So again, thank you all. Hello and welcome to the webinar today on conducting regulatory investigations in a virtual world. And as I said before, we've got 220 people signed up for this webinar, over 220. I think, in fact, it was close to 230 by the time I signed on today. And I'm really pleased and interested to see that there's so many people across the country. We have people from all across Canada and some from the United States who have joined us today. I'm just quickly bringing up the Q&A, and I apologize. This is going to be a little disjointed initially. Some people are saying they have no sound. Let me just double check that I've got myself unmuted. So can somebody else quickly send a message and say that they do have sound so we know whether that's just one person or everybody? Holy moly, okay. Sound is good, okay. Pretty much everybody has sound. So we have so many people that I won't be able to spend time trying to help an individual person with their sound quality, and I apologize for that. But I just want to make sure that we get through this today and everybody gets what they came for. So I want to start. I want to start by just a couple of quick things. Power and internet. You know, sometimes in this day and age, particularly with so many people using these kinds of systems, power and internet can be an issue in terms of losing our signals or having a power disruption. If that happens and I can't quickly get us back online, that will be really unfortunate. I'm not anticipating it'll happen, but if it does, we will reschedule this and for another time. If it takes me 2 or 3 minutes to get us back online, then I will obviously do what I can. The other thing is webinar bombing. Now, I'm not worried with this one. I've set some security settings on here to prevent anything like that from happening, but I'm sure some of you have heard about these problems, particularly on Zoom. I'm not really too worried about it. But if that happens, I will do my best to correct that situation right away. I think we're going to be okay, though. Also, questions. When I wrote this presentation, I said ask anytime and use the Q&A portion. And I'm going to do my best, but with so many people and so many questions that may come in, that might be best to leave it to the end, and I can go through the questions one by one and address them. But you know, I'll do my best to try and manage that as best I can. So you know, any chance I have to have Dr. Evil in a presentation, I will certainly include him. I honestly think that after this pandemic, the working world is going to undergo continued change, and the concept of working from home or working remotely is definitely going to be expanded. You know, many of our clients have the basic foundations in place for these arrangements, but a lot of them have never really had to put them to the test like we do now. And so there's a lot of learning going on across the board, myself included. Now, I also made the mistake of calling this conducting virtual regulatory investigations. And I got thinking about it and realized, well, are we really doing virtual investigations? I mean, when you think about it, the definition of virtual is that something only exists in an apparent way or is not real. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, we are doing a real investigation. We're doing an investigation or an inspection, but we're doing it using different methods to get it done. So what we really have is a new reality or a new methodology, but we're still doing an investigation. And you know, I think back to the history and times where we've had to adapt to change and learn new ways of doing things. And I recall as a young nurse, really still in nursing school actually, when HIV/AIDS sort of hit. And you know, we had to develop precautions to manage that, and eventually referred to those as universal precautions. And that really became the new normal. Another term that has often thrown around when the world experiences something that affects us all. And really this was developed out of a heightened fear and perceived need to keep safe. And it was a real need to keep safe, but there was a lot of overreaction. There was a lot of things that were done in the early days that frankly didn't need to be done. But again, you know, it's that knee-jerk reaction, that pendulum swinging all the way to one side. And here we are again. You know, we always have the need to be safe. We always had the need to be safe. Now suddenly it's just a little scarier. And we see it again here with our new reality, is that we don't know when the next thing, and I'm using air quotes here, is going to hit. We don't know if we're, ever going to go back to what we used to call normal. And really, normal is an ever-changing reality for all of us. So this is really a lesson for us. Will handshakes become a thing of the past? I remember reading an article, a couple of years ago, where somebody was suggesting, well, we should move from handshakes to fist bumps. Now we're doing elbow touches, and who knows where we'll be, when this whole thing is over. Are people going to walk around wearing masks anytime they have a sniffle or a cold? What about access to our loved ones? Our, retirement homes always have restrictions around the transmission of disease and things like that. Is that going to look differently moving forward from here, even once this pandemic is behind us? Right now we don't know the answer to a lot of these questions, and in the meantime, we've got to keep doing our jobs. And so what does this mean for regulatory investigators, and what is this new reality going to be for all of us? And safety really tops the list, right? I mean, safety is the whole reason we're having to change our approach. But I believe we can strike a balance to manage safety and still get the job done. And many are going to find that being forced to change this approach is going to lead to discoveries where we can be more efficient and more productive doing things this way. And in fact, with a lot of our clients, we've been doing this kind of investigation for a very long time. There are some investigations that certainly don't lend themselves to being done remotely. But that being said, we definitely have the ability to find some really interesting and useful efficiencies through this process. And so the implications are that right now, some investigations just aren't going to happen, or the progress on those investigations are going to be held up until rules are slackened and doors reopen. I mean, there are certain kinds of investigations that just can't be done in a virtual approach or a remote approach. One that comes to mind would be an illegal practice investigation. Something like that doesn't lend itself to online interviewing or that kind of approach. So, these are things we'll have to think about. Information gathering obviously is going to change to making requests using electronic means. And these more assertive processes that we've used, things like unannounced visits to offices or clinics, using a summons where we do personal service and show up, unannounced at, trying to exercise those powers of investigation that many of us have, and even search warrants. I mean, a lot of these things are really lost to us at this point. And it's not really an option in most jurisdictions for us to be able to use these approaches. And why is that? Well, obviously a number of reasons. A lack of PPE would be one. Do we want to be going out and doing an investigation and using up valuable resources that right now are needed on the front lines? In a lot of cases, in fact, in most cases, the places we would be doing these investigations are closed. So there's nothing to really show up to anyway. And then we also have to think about timing. The timing of a lot of investigations. Is this the time during this crisis at this moment to be doing certain kinds of investigations, or are we going to put some of those things on hold? And so these are some of the short-term realities that we have to think about. But there's also some long-term realities. I mean, this presentation is going to focus more on the short term, but there are some long-term things to think about. There could very well be a backlog of cases that develop. And this means that regulators will need to look at a plan for staffing and resource allocation. As we're not able to do certain things, it's all going to be waiting for us. None of it's going away. Things like site visits. In the long term, we will need to do site visits again. We will need to be showing up in places and doing inspections and doing investigations on site. But we're going to have to balance that against the safety risk. So that some of that may depend on timing, the nature of the case that we're investigating, some of the risk factors for investigators and families. In fact, even investigators who maybe an investigator who has a comorbidity, a health condition that could put them at more serious risk. Some of these individuals may need to be accommodated, and organizations are going to have to be thinking about that. Well, can this investigator still do some of the things that we normally would request of them to do? So there's a lot of things that regulators are going to have to be thinking of, particularly those who work in the health sector. Maybe regulators are going to have to start stocking their own PPE to be available for investigators to use in the future. And the decision making around these things is going to get harder, not easier. I mean, right now it's pretty easy. I mean, we don't have a lot of choice. There's no site visits. There's no face-to-face interviews. But later when we start to open up, when we start to be able to do things at least somewhat the way we did in the past, decisions are going to have to be made, and we're going to have to turn our minds to this type of thing. I'm going to take a moment here and just take a quick look at the question and answer here, just to quickly see if there's. Oh, sorry. Somebody's asking, what is PPE? Sorry, that stands for personal protective equipment. So that would be things like masks, face guards, gowns, gloves, the things that we need to keep safe when dealing with individuals who could be infected or transmitting sorry, what's the word? Possibly contagious. So yeah, getting back to that, I mean, this is the type of thing that regulators are going to have to start thinking about. Today, I'm going to focus mainly on the short-term changes. These longer-term things are issues that will need to be addressed in due course. And my suggestion to regulators is start having those discussions now and prepare and think long-term. What are the changes that we're going to have to make? So in terms of today, I want to talk about a few sort of key areas. I want to talk about safety. That is obvious. And I'm going to talk about that in the context of everything I discussed today. So it is at the top of the list, and it always should have been at the top of the list, in my opinion. I've spoken, some of you have probably heard me speak on investigator safety and even regulatory bodies safety and the things that need to be done both within organizations and in terms of how people do their jobs in order to remain safe. And I think that's something that we can't lose sight of. And we're going to address that, throughout the course of the presentation. But we're going to focus as well on things like communication, access to information, confidentiality, and human interaction. And I've sort of lumped things into one of these four different categories, and we'll go through it, bit by bit, and start with communication. Now, all of our communication is going to need to be considered in the context of convenience, cost, and accessibility. Accessibility being an important one. I certainly could pose a rhetorical question to you, around how many of you have an online method for people to make complaints. If you don't have something like that, it might be worth considering. If we're going to be doing more things using online technology, then having a process that can be initiated through online technology could be a helpful starting point. Right off the bat, you're going to know, this isn't going to capture everyone, but it could make it easier for some to make their complaints, and may be useful in establishing communications electronically right from the beginning. You'll know what people have. If you don't already, you should also be looking at some kind of document sharing platform. There's a ton of them out there. We work with obviously dozens of regulators, and we've seen a variety of different systems, some custom made for the regulator, others such as SharePoint, Box. There's document exchange programs like Hightail, Titanfile, Tracument. There's a long list of these types of sharing platforms. And, this is something that I think every regulator, if they don't already, should be looking at getting implemented. Also, in many cases, regulators, they would typically receive a complaint in writing. And in fact, some legislation requires their complaints to be received in writing. And then once we get those complaints, we would write letters to the parties. The complainant, the registrant would then receive letters, and then we would follow up on those letters with phone calls. Now we might wish to consider going the reverse of this, that maybe the first contact we make is by telephone, and we follow up with written communication once we've made contact. Now, I know there might be arguments made that, well, just phoning somebody and telling them there's a complaint against them could be jarring. It could. There's no doubt about that. But in these uncertain times around courier deliveries and mail deliveries and where people are, I would argue that it's more important to be able to reach out and actually make the connection with people, and then we can worry about the other stuff later. When we have that phone contact, that's where we can start to establish how the communication will happen, whether you're going to use email or video conferencing or mixes of communication platforms. This is basically your chance to educate the people you're going to be dealing with on what the investigation process will look like, not only in terms of the official process of investigation, but also what's the communication going to look like? What are the things that we're going to do? Now, this isn't going to apply to every investigation that you do, but it certainly will be a useful way of getting things started. It really allows you to determine the people's ability to communicate using alternative means. Do they have a computer? Do they have internet access? What are the things that they have available to themselves to be able to work with us? In terms of interviewing, if we're going to be doing our interviews through some other means other than face-to-face, then we need to consider, how we're going to do this and approach things a little differently. And I'm sure many of you have been doing telephone and video conferencing interviews for some time. I know that for a fact, related to many of our clients. And in some cases that is the norm, but in other cases, face-to-face just doesn't really work and may not really be the most appropriate way. I would think things that are very, very serious, sexual abuse allegations, where you really need that personal connection in order to conduct some of the interviews and things like that. I would argue that those are the kinds of cases that really should be done face-to-face if at all possible. Now, that doesn't mean we can sit on a sexual abuse case for the next 3 months till we figure that out. We're going to have to do what we can do. But video conferencing is the next best thing. And I believe is really almost as good as face-to-face in 90+% of the cases. The other time where video conferencing becomes a challenge is when you have a document-laden case where you need to compare documents or refer to them frequently or point things out in documents. And that can be a real challenge when you're dealing with using a system like this, where it's going to add a tremendous amount of time to the actual length of the interview, because sharing those documents is going to be more time consuming. So we're going to talk about these things in a moment and get into a little more detail about them. But first, I think it's important to address some of the issues that can get in the way of remote interviewing and possibly corrupt or negatively affect the integrity of an investigation. So what are some of those things? Well, first off, we have to ask ourselves, what service are we going to use? And telephone is generally an easy way to communicate with people. How we're going to communicate with them is something we need to think about in advance. And in many cases, telephone's going to work. I mean, I would say telephone is a useful way to conduct an investigation certainly for less serious matters, relatively simple cases where, it's a simple witness interview. There's a low level of controversy likely to be present within the case. Sometimes it may just be our only option. If somebody doesn't have have access to something like video conferencing, maybe they don't have a computer or even a cell phone, telephone may be our only option. Also in cases where we don't have any documents to share, these are, telephone works very well. And we do a lot of investigations primarily using the telephone. However, we do have cases that really deserve a little more than a telephone. We really need to sometimes see the people we're dealing with. Think about, for example, an incapacity investigation where somebody is alleged to have some sort of maybe a mental health issue, maybe some other kind of illness or condition that we're looking into. Oftentimes we do want to meet with those people to get a real flavor of what we're dealing with and frankly what they're dealing with. So in cases like that, we do need to take it up a notch wherever possible. And so then that leads us to video conferencing. And the first thing I would say about video conferencing is that it's absolutely crucial that you understand and familiarize yourself with the technology. I'll be honest with you, I've been stressing over this webinar for a week now, thinking about, what if I do something stupid? What if I mess up the technology? What if somebody, Zoom bombs us or whatever the heck it's called? I've been thinking about these things because it is new to a lot of us, and we really do have to, get our heads wrapped around it. So it's really critical that you do familiarize yourself with this stuff and know what things can and cannot do. How does Zoom work versus FaceTime? What are the limitations? There's been a lot in the press lately about Zoom and its lack of security. When this whole thing started, we already were using Zoom in our office, and then all of a sudden out came all the concerns about security And now we're looking at changing that, or at least trying to see if Zoom can do something to give us those assurances. FaceTime, however, you can't share documents with FaceTime, but it's extremely secure. It can be on your phone. One of the simplest things I've done is just buy a little $10 tripod, stick my phone on it, set up FaceTime, use that as the video piece, and then use my computer to take my notes. It works well. It's got end-to-end encryption, so it's very secure and safe. But if we need to share documents or show documents or do anything like that, then FaceTime isn't going to be the right thing. Zoom has the issues with security, but you can share the documents and you can even record the session. Something else I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. There's lots of other programs out there. There's Microsoft Teams, GoToMeeting, BlueJeans, Signal. There's all kinds of options. And I think you need to explore those options and decide which ones are going to be the best for you and for your organization. Your confidence in using the platform also, and being able to assist the person you're interviewing with any problems, it goes a long way to helping that interviewee stay comfortable and relaxed as you conduct that interview. If you're fumbling around and unsure of your technology, this can become a real issue. Prior to any interviews, have a telephone conversation. Explain what you're going to be doing and how you're going to be doing it, how the video conferencing works. Explain the equipment. Let them know that you're going to be sending an email, for example, to invite them. This is how they connect. All of these things are going to be a little bit of added time to sort of on the admin side of your investigation, but they're well worth the investment to take that 5 minutes and have that phone call to make sure everything's set up right. And you're going to want to build in some time at the beginning of your interview, to work through any sort of assistance that the subject might need or any technological issues that might come up. So, and of course, telephone becomes your backup. So you want to make sure you have a number to call in the event that there are some technical issues. Can I get this person on the phone? Can we get past these issues, or are we going to have to resort to a phone interview? So these are all things that we need to be thinking about when we're doing this. Some of the technical issues, recording the interview. You might want to record the interview, and we generally recommend this as being the gold standard for ensuring that you've got an accurate record of the interview. I'm a big believer in recording interviews. Of course, you have to get the permission of the person you're interviewing. That's a given, but it is something that you should do. And most of these video conferencing platforms have a recording function that's as simple as clicking a button, and the whole thing gets recorded. So it can be extremely simple to use. You're going to want to obviously not have that recording function operational at the start of the conversation. What I would do is start the interview by explaining that you would like to record it. You can explain to them that normally face-to-face, I would just have you maybe sign off on my notes, but since we're not meeting face-to-face, so we'd like to record the interview, get their permission, explain to them how much easier that will be. And then once they agree, then you hit the record button, provide the date, the time, your name, the name of the person you're interviewing, and state for the record that the interview is being recorded, and ask that interviewee to confirm their agreement to being recorded. So that's captured on the recording. And then once you've done that, you're all set. Then you're still going to take notes. You're still going to do what you have to do. But the good thing about this is that you're going to have a very useful record of the investigation interview, and that's very important. For those of you wondering about technical concerns around confidentiality and things like that, don't fear that. That's coming. So I haven't forgotten about the confidentiality piece. We're going to get on that and talk about some of the things we need to do to protect the integrity of the investigation around all these technical things that we're doing. In terms of telephone, well, again, I'm still a big believer in recording the call. Our phone system at our office just has a button. Push the button, it's being recorded. It immediately records, saves the recording on our server, and we're good to go. Again, we still go through the process of getting permission and everything I just explained. You can plug an audio recorder into most telephones, and if you're using a cell phone, there's apps you can get like Call Recorder, Tape a Call, that you can put on your phone. A lot of them are even free, that you can put on your phone, and it will capture the recording of the call, both sides. So it's really not hard. And as I say, I think recording is the way to go. There may be some that would argue with me about recording and say, well, I'm not so sure that's what we would want. Obviously, we defer to our clients' choices around that, but I do think it's something that it's hard to refute that recording is I've had people try to argue with me about it and present reasons why it shouldn't be done. And while this talk isn't about that, I think I can very effectively argue that point. So without further ado, I'll just move on to some of the considerations around interviewing. In the end, this is important to remember. Your interview is no different than any other interview. And the fact that you're not face-to-face doesn't really change the essentials of interviewing. And you really need to stick to what you do best. The less you alter your approach, the less you're going to need to adapt. There's things you need to do a little differently, and we'll talk about that. One of the things you need to think about is your appearance and your video background. And I don't mean to be insulting when I say this, but some platforms do offer backgrounds, like a fake background that you can put behind you. In fact, I had a call, just a friendly call with a friend, and when he came onto the screen, he had the Simpsons living room superimposed behind him. It looked like he was in the Simpsons living room, which was kind of comical. Obviously, that wouldn't be a very professional thing to do when conducting an interview, but be aware of that. Recognize those those backgrounds are there. There's some professional backgrounds that you can use as well if you don't feel that you want to have your own space captured in the video. That's not a problem. Remember, when you're working from home, you still have to look the part. I think there's a lot of people that are finding that as they've been working from home, you dress a little more casually, and it's important to still dress the part and recognize that you're still representing the organization that you're working for. Building rapport. You really have to build rapport as you normally would. In fact, I would argue you need to build rapport even more so when you're doing things by video conference or by telephone. You can do this through sharing or explaining the process, and always allow the person you're interviewing to ask questions. They can ask questions about the process. They can ask questions about the technology. It's a great way to engage people, is give them the opportunity, give them a little control, let them ask some questions. It loosens them up, makes them feel a little more comfortable, and really can be very helpful. Assure that you're keeping the interview private, that nobody else is around, and communicate that. Like let them know. Listen, I'm in a private space, and of course, if you're going to make that case, make sure that's true. Don't have any kids running around, jumping into the picture or making noise in the background. And I know for some of us that's very difficult right now with kids being off school, and we're all working in a new environment. So I'm sure there's a little bit of forgiveness that can be built into all of this when unexpected things happen. But nevertheless, you need to do your best to try and manage that for sure. Some of the interviewing considerations as well. One is to allow for breaks. Offer breaks as needed, and explain how you're going to manage that. Some platforms like Zoom, for example, there actually are breakout rooms. So if an interviewee has a representative or legal counsel who's also connected, you can show them how to use the breakout room and let them do that. So they can go off and have their own little private conference and leave you out of it, and then come back into the room when they're ready. Be aware, of course, of your surroundings. Don't allow any distractions to cause you to be looking around. For me, that's tough. I'm a bit of a easily distracted individual, to be quite honest, and it's easy for me to look around the room or look away from the camera. That's really accentuated when you're on a video call. So when you're on a video call, people are basically looking at your head, and so when your eyes start to veer and start to go around the room, they don't know that you're not talking to somebody or looking at somebody. So you have to try to be very focused and avoid that kind of thing. Looking at the camera, especially when you're speaking, to give the interviewee some confidence that you're really engaged in the conversation. And you don't want to be this person. When using the camera, try to avoid apps that can turn us into long-eared dogs. I swear if I have to see any more of these types of images on Instagram, I might just stop going on Instagram. I'm so sick of it. Anyway, that's my feeble attempt at humor. One of the things that comes up often when it comes to, doing an interview on the telephone or doing an interview on a video conference is people worry about the ability to assess credibility. Now, I know that investigators conducting regulatory investigations are not really meant to be assessing credibility for the purposes of reporting conclusions or telling anybody, hey, I don't believe this guy or I don't believe that woman. I get that. But investigators do need to get a sense of credibility in order to inform the investigation. That can help them to determine next steps, can determine a questioning strategy. Do I need to interview more people? So, regardless of the fact that our job is not to assess credibility in any kind of official capacity and report that out, assessing credibility is something investigators do in every single interview because, as I say, that can really make a difference. Now, when you're on the telephone, that can be particularly difficult because you lose a huge chunk of communication. Essentially almost all nonverbal communication, body language, interpretations, all of those things are lost when you're not in a face-to-face scenario. But don't worry about the nonverbal. Making judgments on people's credibility is tough enough when you're doing it face-to-face. And any of you who've heard me speak on this particular topic will know that I'm not actually a huge fan of drawing too much inference from things like facial expressions and body language. There are experts out there that can do it. There are people out there that have a very good sense of these kinds of things. But so it does have its usefulness, but much less so on a video conference and pretty much impossible on the telephone. And really, when you have people on the telephone or a video conference, it can affect their communication style and lead to unusual tics or mannerisms that might even be misleading to you. And I've often told a story, I won't bore you all with it here again, but I've often told a story about a time I was giving a talk and a lady was sitting in the back of the room, and I completely misinterpreted her body language. And it was really quite a comical story. But she was sitting I guess I am telling the story. She was sitting cross-armed and looked miserable. And the whole time I'm talking, I'm thinking, well, she doesn't like what I'm saying. Of course, I got to the question period and I asked if anyone had any questions. Her arm fired up with this miserable look on her face. Here I'm thinking I'm going to get it from her both barrels. And it turns out she was just cold and said in a sweet little voice at the back of the room, "Can I close this window? I'm freezing." And so I always use that example as one that highlights just how easy it is to misinterpret body language and nonverbal communication. As I say, it's got its usefulness, but there's plenty of ways that we can, figure out and think about a person's credibility. And I've got a few of those on the slide here. Is what they've said plausible? I mean, that's the first question to ask yourself. Are you getting a plausible story, or does it really not make any sense? Can what has been said be corroborated? Are there documentation or witnesses that can speak to these things? Consider some of the behaviors of the people that you're interviewing. Are they defensive? Are they angry or dismissive? Are they trying to discredit other people? Often these are telltale signs that people are their credibility is questionable. And so these are the kinds of things that you can take into consideration as you move through trying to do that credibility assessment as you go. So ask probing questions, about specifics. Be very detailed. The truth is in the details, I always say. And so don't gloss over things. Don't accept general denials or general statements. Try to get into the nitty-gritty with people, because that's really where you're going to be able to pick up on whether or not people are being truthful with you. Pay attention to efforts by any interviewee to reframe or change the context. You'll often get people say, well, yeah, that happened, but here's really the context of it. Yeah, it might be valuable and truthful and useful information, or it may not, but pay attention to it because it can be useful. And also think about the motive. What's the motive that a person might have to be truthful or untruthful when they express a certain position. So all of these things can really help you to determine the veracity of what's being said. Now, interviewing on the telephone is something else that I wanted to touch on, because I think we do need to alter our style a little bit, particularly on the telephone. When you're interviewing on the telephone, really, there are some things that can make it go smoothly. Tone and pace can really, in my opinion, make or break a telephone interview. So try to avoid matching what you get from the other end of the call. And what I mean by that is sometimes people on the phone can be dismissive. They can be in a hurry to end the call. They can even be aggressive. It seems to me that some people develop courage when they're not in the same room as you, or when they can't be seen. So use de-escalation techniques to manage behavior, and take your time on the call. Remember that you're the one in charge, and you don't have to take a take charge attitude or be officious, but at the same time, there are things you can do to try and manage that behavior. Another thing is to use softer questioning language. You come across friendlier and more open when you do this. And remember, just as you can't see the other person's nonverbal, they can't see yours. So they don't see a smile on your face necessarily when you're on the phone. They don't see the expression that you have. And oftentimes, I can ask a person a tough question face to face with a certain expression on my face that can be very disarming. And I can get away with asking that question. If I ask it the same way on a telephone call, it may not go as well. So you have to be thoughtful of that. The other thing too is to speak once in a while. Sometimes people will give you a long narrative. Say things like, I see, I understand, things to let them know you're there, let them know you're still listening. I don't know about you, but I've been on the phone before where, I've been talking away, and then partway through, I suddenly just, for whatever reason, get this feeling they're not on the line anymore. So I feel like I have to say, are you still there? So maybe that's something that can be prevented by you sort of trying to be an active listener through engaging and making some of these comments. Also, try to be prepared to use more probative questioning. Typically I advocate for using a technique of allowing interviewees to provide sort of long narratives, asking open-ended questions and letting them share their story. And I still believe that is the best way to interview, and that can still work on the telephone. But there are people that won't work with. There are people who will be uncomfortable, who will have a hard time talking for any length of time on the phone. And so be prepared to take a different approach and use more probing questions and direct questions to kind of push them along. Now, in terms of note-taking, I don't want this to be a basic webinar on interviewing technique, but I do think that note-taking is something to at least touch on. And I think it's important to tell the person that you're going to take notes, especially, if you're on the telephone, it's really not a big deal. They don't really see what you're doing while you're on the phone. But if you're in a video conference, try to pull your head up from your computer or your paper occasionally and make eye contact again. It's very easy to slip into this sort of, well, I'm just listening to them, you're not really looking at them. You want to still try to maintain that connection. Maybe use two computers or a computer and a cell phone if you're typing and taking notes. Try not to cram everything into one computer screen, especially if you're working off a laptop. That can be kind of challenging. And when taking notes, obviously be objective. It's observations and information only, not interpretations or conclusions. If somebody gets belligerent and angry with you on the phone, don't characterize it in your notes as the person became belligerent. Instead, characterize it as the person, raised the volume of their voice and stated blah, blah, blah. These are things you need to do to try and maintain that objectivity and maintain that appearance, and hopefully the reality that you're not biased. In terms of documenting your own thoughts, don't do that on your official statement. Keep your own thoughts separate. If you're making notes, to remind yourself to go back and talk to somebody, ask another question, or circle back to another point that was discussed earlier. Keep those notes separate. Take notes even if you're audio taping. You never know if the audio tape is going to fail, and so you still want to be able to take some notes and have them as a backup. In terms of document sharing, if you need to compare or reference documents, you really have two choices. You can send them in advance through a secure sharing portal or an encrypted email service. Although you may not want to be sending sensitive or confidential documents out there. So this often isn't a good idea unless those documents are in fact easily shared and sort of public and not confidential. The other option you have is to share them during the interview using the screen share feature. A screen share feature is what I'm doing right now by sharing the PowerPoint presentation with all of you. The nice thing about this is it allows you to keep control of the document and protect confidentiality, although that doesn't prevent somebody from pulling out their cell phone and taking a picture of the screen. But at the end of the day, you can only do what you can do. The nice thing about document sharing on these platforms is that you can use your cursor and actually highlight and show the person something you want them to refer to or talk about, or something you want them to see. So, this can be really, really helpful. And there's, obviously pros and cons to both of them. The one thing I would say is that this is going to eat time in your interview. So you're going to need to start preparing to have longer interviews if you need to share a lot of documents, because it's going to take time to bring them up, to show them, to review them, and it's going to add a little time. So just be prepared for that. Of course, when you accidentally share the wrong screen, you can find yourself feeling a little frightened. The last thing any of us want is a privacy commissioner calling us to discuss our miscue. In terms of statement reviews, some organizations want statements to be reviewed by the people that are being interviewed. So in this case, you can email it and have it emailed back. You can use a program like DocuSign if your organization subscribes to that. And again, you can use a screen share and record the verbal confirmation. We've been doing a lot of that lately, particularly on our workplace side, where what we do is just show them their statement, let them review it, make whatever changes need to be made, and then the whole communication is being recorded, and then we read to them at the bottom that I have had an opportunity to review this statement and agree that it is accurate, an accurate reflection of what I've said, or blah blah blah, but something like that at the end of the statement, and have them confirm that, and that can be a very efficient way to have this done. One of the things we do is face-to-face interviews. We have an electronic signature pad that we use, and so what we'll do is have the person review the notes that we've taken on our computer, confirm it, we change it if we have to, we save it as a PDF, and then they sign their signature to the electronic document on the PDF, and then it's saved in an uneditable PDF, so it can't be altered. And that can be really handy. Right now, you can't really do that using screen sharing or any of the technology, but necessity is the mother of invention, they say. So I'm sure something like that's probably coming. So that's my point on that. In terms of access to information, this is another issue that we have to deal with. And in most cases, we can get what we need through formal requests. We can have information couriered to us or sent to us electronically. Our biggest obstacle really for access to information are those cases where we typically would have to attend a location to get what we need. And this could still be a problem. The unannounced visit, for example, when we need to go into a place and get something and we're fearful that that document or documents we want might be tampered with. And that's just an issue that we're going to have to grapple with over time and figure out what we're going to do. For some people though, and for some organizations, that kind of approach is very rarely needed. I'll use, for example, nursing. Most of the time you're getting documents from a medical records department in a hospital, and there isn't a concern about those records being altered or changed in any way. So, for 90+% of cases, that's not really going to be an issue. But for other types of professions, it can be a significant issue, and so we have to try to think of some ways to manage that. Things like personal service of summons and search warrants really aren't available now for a variety of reasons. It's just things that we can't really control at the moment, and we're going to have to, as I said earlier, think about how we're going to manage these things going forward. Since things are mostly closed down right now, there's less need for doing those kinds of or taking those kinds of actions. Although we have had one client ask us to do surveillance on an organization that is practicing and operating when they are not on the essential service list. So there is still some field work that can happen, because you could do that without really exposing yourself and maintaining social distancing. So depending on what's required, we can still do what we need to do, and each case really has to be assessed on its own merits. Can we do inspections without going on site? Yeah, I believe we can. Obviously, with the caveat that they're going to have significant limitations. We can do online or telephone questions, have the person in charge of the place use their phone to show us things we might need to see. We can go through a checklist of items with appropriate Q&A. We're currently doing a large scope project like this for one organization. we can make it clear to people that a face-to-face inspection will happen when it's possible, and answers to questions now will be reviewed later for accuracy. So, ensure that they know that, false statements could be interpreted as professional misconduct or violations. So there's definitely ways that we can work around these things. Now, in terms of confidentiality, again, sort of leaning toward the technology issue, there's a few things that you can do. There's really a litany of issues that we need to be aware of. And, I think that things that we can do on our end to save problems are important things to do. So we need to enable two-factor authentication for access to your organization's data sites. Now, for those of you who don't know what two-factor authentication is, what it is, and we have it in our office, if one of our investigators wants to get into our network, obviously they have to log in and use a password. And then what happens is on their cell phone through a separate app, they get an approval request, and then they have to hit that approval request and enter a code that generates every so many seconds in order to get into the system. What this does is prevent people who might have managed to get your password from getting in, because even if they get your password, they're not going to receive the approval request for the second. So that's the second factor of authentication. So it's a simple thing. It's not very costly, and it can really add a layer of security that can make a big difference. Also, when it comes to sharing files, only use online portals that are proven safe. Be very careful and do your research around those things, and maybe consider an encrypted email service. Educate yourself and your staff. This is critically important. Save documents on the secure server that you use. Don't save documents on laptops and desktops. If you've got a secure server or a system like SharePoint or something like that, you need to do that. Leaving documents on your desktop or laptop, or worse, a USB stick, makes them vulnerable to anyone who might get control of those things, or if those items are lost or stolen. Another thing is move away from Hotmail and Yahoo if you're using it. These have been shown to be subject to scanning by some companies for commercial marketing purposes. And while this is unlikely to happen, why would you want to expose yourself to that? It really, and some people would argue that when you're using a Hotmail or a Yahoo email account, it might look a little unprofessional, not to mention the fact that you look like a dinosaur. That's something to consider as well. If emails go astray and they contain names, that can be a real problem. So don't put names in emails if you can avoid it at all. And recognize that there's an increased potential for phishing emails. This is huge. Phishing emails have grown exponentially since the pandemic started, and they were already a problem before that. So you have to be aware and be careful, and this is why the two-factor authentication is so important, because it can really save you a lot. In terms of practice considerations around confidentiality, make it clear that confidentiality is of prime importance to the person you're talking to, and ask the interviewee to ensure that they're in a private and confidential place. Clear your workspace of people. In this situation, that has proven to be difficult for some people. I've had many calls interrupted by kids and pets and all kinds of things. Consider using earbuds as well. At least then the person will see you wearing the earbuds on a video conference, and that means that their voice isn't booming all around the room. So that's helpful. And make sure that if there's support people, lawyers or union representatives involved, make sure that they understand that this is the expectation as well. And I'm sure most would, but it's definitely something to consider. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about human interaction. And there is an impersonal nature to remote communications, and we really need to be aware of that and find ways to bring the human connection into the process. Some people would argue that our society has already lost the personal touch of communication with the advent of smartphones and social media, even just the internet generally. And now, out of necessity, we're looking at even more ways to avoid face-to-face interaction. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that gap. We try to minimize the impersonal nature of these communications, and maybe share information, explain why we have to do it. Try to make the experience as positive as you can, and really work hard at establishing rapport with people. It's okay to share a story. Discuss the current situation in the world, maybe even say how much you're looking forward to something like watching your favorite sports team play again, or something like that. Really try to make that connection with people, because it really makes a huge difference. Now, I've raced through a lot of information here, and I do have some time for questions. And what I'm going to do is bring up this Q&A, and I see that there has been a ton. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute. I'm going to start my video so you can see my smiling face and we can have that human interaction. And now I'm going to try to work through some of these questions. And I apologize, we've gone a little over time. We're up to 207 people that have joined us, so I'm thrilled with that. And I really hope you folks have been finding this useful. So one person says that they were told, I'm not going to show these questions. I'm just going to go through them with you. And we may go a little over time. If we do, you're welcome to stay on. I'm going to keep going. But for those of you who have to move on, I certainly understand. We've got a few minutes yet though. So one person said that they were told that FaceTime is not secure and that chats can go viral. My research hasn't shown that. Now I'm not an IT specialist or an IT guru, so I'm not gonna. I don't want to get into a debate over it because who knows? Maybe I'm wrong. I think that shows the vulnerability that we're all facing. We're definitely facing a vulnerability around knowing the right things about all of this. So I think it's something that we definitely have to think about. My understanding is FaceTime has end-to-end encryption and is not something that people can hack into. Or if someone could, it would be somebody with enormous skills who probably wouldn't be interested in your conversation anyway. What else do we have here? Do we have to receive consent to record, or can we inform them that we are recording for the purpose of minute taking and we'll delete it after? Well, I mean, as long as they're aware that you're recording, I prefer to get consent. I prefer not to put the recording on until they say they're okay with it. So if you want to use that as the reason for recording and say, I want to record this for the purposes of minute taking and I will delete it after, then by all means have that conversation with them. I would not start the conversation with recording on, because they're going to likely see that. Most of these apps will show the other party they're being recorded. And if it starts like that, it could create a concern for some of them. So that would be my concern. Somebody said credibility has a great deal of impact on what I need as corroborating evidence. I agree. Credibility is important and can be very useful. And can be very informative to your investigation and the steps that you take. In most regulatory investigations, we're not drawing conclusions so much. We're providing information so others can draw conclusions. That's not true all the time, but most of the time. And I agree. I think credibility is very important. How you go about determining whether somebody is credible, to me, is less about whether they're fidgety or their arms are crossed or they're, they have a certain look on their face, and more about the substance of what they say. So that would be my take on that one. Someone else said, if I delete documents from my laptop, does that eliminate the security problem? I would say that it's fine I work on my laptop. When I'm out in the field, I'm definitely working on my laptop. I try at my earliest convenience, even if I have to use a hotspot from my phone, to get myself connected to the server and get it uploaded to the server. I think again, it comes down to timing. I've heard horror stories about people who have, brought documents, or not. Well, I mean, documents is another thing. I mean, if you've got hard copy documents and you go on a subway and forget them on the subway, oops, you've got a problem. The same thing could be true of a USB stick or a laptop. I'm all about minimizing the opportunity for breaches of confidentiality. I don't want the grief, to be honest. So I think as long as you've got a system in place and you feel that you're managing that system well, then I think that you have to make your own judgment calls on a lot of that. Somebody asked if, oh yes, I will definitely get the slides out to you as if I can. Well, I should be able to. It shouldn't be a problem. Might just take a couple of days because there's a lot of you. You talked briefly about colleges using electronic sharing platforms for secure sharing of documents. Please, can you say a little more examples of safe ones? Well, there's a lot of them out there. I could just keep listing them off. There's SharePoint is one. Some of our clients use SharePoint, and so do we. So that makes the synergy of that very good. a lot of it is about having the right settings on these things. There's a lot of great platforms out there, but you need expert assistance to ensure that the settings are engaged in such a way as to create that security. So definitely, there's things like Hightail, Ignite, Box, all kinds of things that you can use, and so definitely, there's a lot of options for you. I see a quick chat comment there about single party consent for recording. I agree that legally, from the perspective of recording somebody, you don't need their consent. However, if you're planning on using that recording in any official way, you better have consent, because it will likely get deemed inadmissible. I also think from an ethical perspective, I don't think people should be recorded unless they're aware of it. So that's just my take on it. I mean, others might have a different opinion, but I would never record somebody without their knowledge, and would certainly never consider, I just wouldn't consider it. The only time we record people without their knowledge is if we're doing an undercover case, where we're going into a place posing as a certain type of person, maybe posing as a customer, and we want to capture what's happening. That's different. But if you're interviewing somebody and you're in an official capacity interviewing someone, you need to get their consent to record them. I believe that's my take on it, and I don't think anybody will sway me otherwise. But again, there's more than one opinion out there on things like this. If you're using Zoom, how can you beat the encrypt, secure the meeting? How can you best, encrypt my eyes, or I'm losing my eyesight. How can you best encrypt or secure the meeting? When it comes to Zoom, the best way to do it is to make sure that people need a password to get in, and that password is only shared with the individuals who are supposed to be in the meeting and nobody else, and that everybody is told, don't share the password. That will be the best way to ensure that you're not going to get bombed. A lot of the Zoom bombing and stuff like that has happened to meetings where it's just been put out there and open to anybody who wants to join in, and that is one of the reasons why people have been able to do this. It's happened a lot in schools where courses are being taught, and there's 150 students, and some of those students share the access with some other student who's not even in the class, who decides it would be funny to photobomb the talk or do something crazy like that. So otherwise, it really comes down to security settings and understanding your specific program that you're using. Are there alternatives to in-person summonses? Well, yes, I believe that a summons can be, when I'm referring to a summons, I'm talking about going into a place unannounced and showing a summons to garner cooperation so you can get what you want. Summonses are still usable and doable right now. Personal service is difficult. But in a lot of cases, when you're dealing with organizations that simply want the security of knowing that they are compelled to provide some information, there's other ways to issue the summons and work with them cooperatively. And I call that a friendly summons. And there definitely are ways to do that. That's certainly another way to exercise the use of a summons. In a lot of cases, we use summonses and send them electronically, and because we're not dealing with an uncooperative individual, we're dealing with an individual who simply wants some level of assurance that they're not going to get in trouble later for sharing documents that would otherwise be private and confidential. Some people have commented on the consent thing around recording and saying that their organization would require that. Another person said they've reviewed cell phone recording apps, suggested, unfortunately, they don't have great reviews, and one of them they tried previously was not great. If there's any others that you can suggest, that would be great. I do have another one. I'm just gapping on which one it is, so I will get back to you with that. Is the USB stick has a password, is that then not secure? The thing about passwords is passwords can be broken. In some cases, like for, especially on documents, passwords can be broken. There are USB sticks you can get that have a really high degree of encryption on them that would be almost impossible to get into. And if you're willing to spend the money on something like that, then perhaps that's an option. I mean, when you think about it, it's not really any different than having a file folder in your briefcase. So in fact, I would argue that the documents in a file folder in your briefcase are even more vulnerable if you were to lose your briefcase or leave it behind somewhere. So I think that's something to consider for sure. Are there any changes to the current legislation regarding timelines? For example, meeting the 150-day disposal timeline? Yes, I believe there are. If you're a member of CNAR, you might want to go to the CNAR forum that speaks about investigations and discipline. I believe there's something in there about that. I will provide some additional information on that later because I don't want to misspeak now. But definitely there have been changes made that have allowed people to do that. I see Jeremy Cannell here making a comment in the chat room that yes, that is the case. So, yeah, there you go. Let's see. Somebody says here, I was told Zoom is secure if you pay for the service. It's secure, but not, again, you got to have your settings right and you got to use it properly. But yes, I think it is, as long as you have your settings set properly and you're not using the free service. Somebody else commented that company policy should state that portable hard drives must be encrypted. Use on encrypted devices should strictly be prohibited, or use on unencrypted devices should be strictly prohibited. I agree, 100%. Someone else said enabling waiting room function on Zoom can help to prevent or decrease Zoom bombing. Participants have to be admitted to the meeting. Yes, exactly. That is another way to control it. And there is definitely things you can do around that. Just looking here, I've seemed to have moved through pretty much all the questions. Let me just go back to the top and see, because I think I started partway through. Somebody said they're wondering if there are any continuing professional development credit hours that you can apply to this talk. You know what? I'll look into that. I have provided continuing professional development credits through the Law Society as well as through the HRPA. I will reach out to those organizations and find out if that's an option after the fact. I didn't set that up in the first place, but if I can, I will definitely make that happen. Then I'm going through all the ones where people say they can hear me, except for one person, and you know who you are. And I know who you are. We'll talk later. Okay, what is PPE? I remember that question. We answered that earlier. Are there any good apps for cell phones, preferably free, in which calls can be recorded? Well, yes, we've talked about that, and I will definitely find the better one that I'm aware of. I believe it's called Tape-A-Call. So I don't know if the person who said they've tried some, it didn't work. Tape-A-Call is supposed to be good, and there's Tape-A-Call Pro. You'll likely want to spend the money on a paid app, though. Anything free just has limitations, in my experience. Pretty much anything that's offered free is going to have limitations. So I'd be very cautious about that. I believe that's it, unless more questions have been added. So I've got a few very nice comments, which I very much appreciate. Again, I will try to do what I can. If you want to get some kind of professional development credit for this talk, could I ask you all to please send me an email asking me, because I'm getting a lot of people now from different jurisdictions across the country asking. And I'm going to definitely, I don't know if these Q&A are going to stay here when I turn this thing off. So I want to be sure that I don't miss you. So send me an email if you want to get PPD credit, and I will see what I can do about that. Now I'm going to leave the Q&A and go over to the chat room here to see if there's anything in here that could be useful to add to the conversation. But I think we've covered pretty much most of it. So I've gone a little over time. I apologize for that. We still have 144 people that stuck around. So I'm going to take that as a good sign that this was useful. I really hope it was. I need to tell you that you know, I've been doing talks for a long time, and this is a real new thing for me. I've done webinars in the past, but not on this sort of scale. And I'm going to bring up a slide for you all. I'm going to share my screen one last time and bring up a slide so that you can see my last slide. And there we go. So that's my contact information for anybody who wants it. As I say, the presentation was recorded. We're going to have to do some editing of it, and hopefully get it out on YouTube channel within the next few days. All I can say is thank you. And if any of you need any help, any assistance, if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. If you've got comments about this webinar, its quality, how it could be improved, or in addition to that, if you have any comments on other topics you might like to see future webinars done, I'm happy to do these. I enjoy it, and if it makes a difference and it's helpful to people, then I'm all in. So thank you again. I wish all of you all the best, and I guess we will call it a show at this point, and I'll say goodbye. Thanks, everybody. Take care.